Record. Recording. All right. So good evening, folks. I want to thank you for coming out this Thursday evening for PACT's webinar, Meeting the Needs of Students Without Home Internet Access. My name is Ryan Carty. I'm one of the members of the Professional Development Committee for PACT. And I have the pleasure of introducing our two presenters this evening, Ms. Susan Bearden and Dr. Beth Holland. Ms. Bearden is the Chief Innovative Officer for the Consortium of School Networking. A former technology leader, she serves as the Senior Fellow in the Office of Educational Technology at the U.S. Department of Education from 2016 and 17, where she led the 2017 update of the U.S. Department of Education's K-12 Technology Infrastructure Guide, Building Technology Infrastructure for Learning. She provides project management support to Google's Rolling Study Halls project and frequently presents about digital equity. She is the former director of COSN's Digital Equity Initiative and led the 2000 update of their Digital Equity Toolkit. And joining her is Dr. Beth Holland. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Rhode Island, as well as a Digital Equity Project Director for the Consortium of School Networking. Over the past 20 years, she's taught in the K-12 classrooms, served as Director of the Academic Technology and at PS8 Independent School, designed professional learning programs for schools around the world and leadership programs to support systemic change. Additionally, she is also a prolific writer, researcher, and speaker. Dr. Holland holds an educational doctorate in entrepreneurial leadership and education from Johns Hopkins University, a master's degree in technology, innovation, and education from Harvard University, as well as a bachelor's in science degree from the Communication of Northwestern University. So once again, I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of PACT for logging on this evening. And thank you to our two presenters for the willingness to spread this word around our Commonwealth. So without further ado, ladies, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us. If it's all right with you, I'll go ahead and share my screen. And
yep, that'd be perfect.
Keep going. So this should work. Does that seem to work?
Perfect.
Perfect, great. And then folks, the link on this first page does take you straight to these slides, so you're welcome to follow along or keep a copy or whatever works for you. But I just wanted to thank everyone for having Susan and I this evening. So you've introduced us, so I don't think we need to introduce ourselves again. But I'm Beth Holland, and I just recently assumed the position as Digital Equity Project Director from Susan, who gave me a very large set of shoes to fill. But this is our contact information, and we'll put it up again at the end of this conversation. And we do welcome you to please reach out if you have any questions or thoughts or ideas or want to share a story. That would certainly be most appreciated. Susan, I don't know if you want to say anything else. And
no, just this is one of my favorite topics, so we're really thrilled to be here. Thank you for having us.
Great. So just to get things going, you know, as Ryan said, we both are working with the Consortium of School Networking, also known as COSN, and we're a professional association for district and school technology leaders. You know, we provide leaders with, you know, management, community building, professional learning, and advocacy support. And I will admit that the advocacy support is something that is new to me, and it's been really exciting to learn since I started. But trying to make sure that, you know, the policymakers in Washington know what we as school leaders need so that we can do what's best for all of the students in this country. And so I think that's a really exciting part of the work that we're doing. And it's an exciting part of this digital equity work, as there are a lot of things going on right now where we can try to influence the future to make sure that we are creating more equitable learning experiences for all of our students. So what we've really realized is, you know, there's been a lot of talk about this idea of the digital divide. And in fact, the 1996 National Education Technology Plan was really the first mention of the idea of a digital divide in education. And they talked about this idea of a gap between the information haves and the information have-nots. And since that time, thanks to federal programs like the E-rate program, which helps to get, you know, subsidies and reimbursements for wiring schools and buildings, because of programs like the work that we've done at COSN, you know, a lot of schools have managed to get access physically in the buildings. But as Jessica Rosenworcel, who's commissioner at the FCC, said several years ago, what is actually the cruelest part of the digital divide is what's emerged in what she's termed the homework gap. meaning that even if students have access in school, once they leave school, they don't necessarily have access. And that could be for a number of different reasons. And so these are some recent statistics, which I think, the irony of it is that we're online right now. As Susan said, she doesn't have her video run right now because of low bandwidth. So even though we're in the situation where we're trying to have these conversations, there are still so many students who don't have access. A couple of reports that I pulled, that were recent, one was from the ACT Center for Equity, where they found that 19% of underserved students reported that they only had access to a single device. And they defined underserved as students who might be first generation going to college, coming from a household with a family income below $35,000 a year, maybe not an English speaking household. So it was some factor in there that they qualified as underserved. But they only had a single device, usually a smartphone, and insufficient internet access. And so if we think about what our students might need to do, whether it's, doing some research, writing a paper, I don't know how many of us even get frustrated sending an email sometimes. It's more than a paragraph on a phone. And so now imagine doing your assignments and know that potentially 19% of our students, particularly those who need the most support, don't have the access that they need. Further, the Pew Research Center, with some 2018 data, so this was from the fall, found that 35% of households with school-aged children and that income of less than $35,000 a year lacked access to high-speed internet. So again, we're compounding problems that already exist, that might be existing because of, again, geography, income level, and now we're taking away access. And at the same time, and this, to qualify this statistic from the National Center for Education Statistics, that 80% of 8th graders indicated they needed a computer to do their homework. That was from a recent report, but based on 2015 data. And so I would wonder if that number is actually higher. And so we can see that there's this gap that's emerged where students are being asked more and more to use the internet, to use technology in order just to stay up to date with their assignments. And yet so many of them don't have the access that they need. And then the CoSN actually, in their most recent infrastructure report, and I'm gonna let Susan chime in on this a little bit as well, found that when they surveyed all of their districts, 92% reported that they've met the minimum bandwidth requirements from the FCC. So if you think about 92% of schools saying that they have bandwidth in school, but only 10% of district leaders felt that all of their students had access once they left school. And so again, that's setting up a huge discrepancy between those students who have access and those students who don't. And so there's been talk about, closing the digital divide. And while that certainly is happening in some places, it's not happening in an equitable manner yet. And I'll use yet, as I think there's a lot of work that we can do. But it's certainly something that we need to keep in mind. I'm going to pause here for a second because we do have, people here live and nobody wants to listen to someone spew a lot of statistics. So I don't know if, Susan wants to jump back in for a minute, or if anyone has any questions just as we're getting started.
Yeah, this is Susan. Just, it's been interesting because over the past several years, there's been so much effort to try to connect schools and provide our schools with high-speed broadband. And it's still not 100%. There are still schools in some very remote areas that don't meet what the FCC considers the minimum bandwidth requirements for schools, but it's much, much better than it was, say, 5-6 years ago. So now it's almost kind of like, now that the schools have all this connectivity, we need to make sure that our students also have the connectivity at home.
And just to add, we'll keep going. And again, please chime in, anyone who's watching live or in the chat, and we will pause. But just to think about this too, again, it's really, where the homework gap is existing. There's certainly challenges of geography, where students in rural areas generally have, more limited access than students who might be in suburbs or cities or towns. Students who are living, below the poverty threshold have the lowest rates of home internet access. And then one that I spent some time researching, and I think this is an important fact to come back to, is often it's students from underserved communities who, even in school when they have access, are primarily using technology for remediation and testing. We can call it drill and skill or drill and kill exercises, but there's a huge discrepancy between students who are really consuming with technology and those who are starting to do research and analysis and creation and collaboration. Since we're talking in Pennsylvania, I remember reading a news article about a year ago just talking about the discrepancies between two different districts in Pittsburgh, where in one, the students were partnered with Carnegie Mellon and they were doing robotics and computational thinking and all these really amazing ideas. And then the journalists went to another district that was right nearby and, started asking questions. And for the most part, if the students ever used any technology, if they had it, it was pretty much for test prep. And so just to see a discrepancy that was really in a close area is something that I think we need to keep in mind, that it's not just, it's not just about access, it's about how people are really starting to use the technology and whether or not we're creating further equity challenges based on, are you just a passive consumer or are you being empowered really as an active creator? And I see in the chat, Tracy mentioned, I'll read this, Tracy, if you don't mind, since I know recording people can't read chats. But Tracy's working with the district that I thank you for telling me because I couldn't remember the name of it, but it's Stowe Rocks, where they're isolated and they're not necessarily getting the same amount of resources as what she says is, as Pittsburgh Public Schools. And so there is that challenge of not only the access to devices and the access to, to the technology and the bandwidth, but really how students are being empowered to use that technology. And, some of the studies, and as a researcher, I'm always happy to provide citations, but there was a huge study that was done in Florida in 2017, where they found that because of online testing, most schools did have devices and access. And then the actual, looking at the number of devices, the number of connections was fairly equal across the state. But again, how students were being empowered to use those devices and how teachers were provided, everything from professional development to tech support, that was not yet being provided in an equitable manner. So, this digital divide and the homework gap is really something that is a pressing equity issue that I know that Susan and I are both very passionate about and trying to come up with ways to address it. And Tracy, thank you so much for providing that extra information. I'm pausing again, see if anyone else has any other thoughts or questions. When, again, starting to think about, causes of what's happening, one of the issues is, causes of this homework gap is that, high-speed broadband just isn't available. And I think that happens in schools as well. I had the opportunity to speak to a tech director from Northern Alaska, and they have internet in, his 12 village districts. But he said it was definitely not high speed and it just isn't available. And again, the Pew Research Center did some recent surveys. 58% of rural Americans say that access is a problem, and 24% say it's a major problem. And so, that's a large part of our very large country to realize that just based on geography. As a side note, and Susan's going to talk about this more when she gets to it, because I will admit to not fully understanding the technology aspects of it. There is some work being done right now by an organization called Shelby, which is the Schools Health Librarians Broadband Coalition, where they're advocating for something called EBS, Education Broadband Spectrum, as a way of trying to bridge the homework gap specifically in rural areas. And I will turn it over to Susan when we get to that part, because I'm now saying that's as much as I understand of how it works right now. So it is something that we can think about. The second cause, again, is finance. Access is expensive. A lot of times, students might say that they have internet access, but it might be limited to a cell phone and a cap data plan. Some families might not be aware of discounted plans, or I had a technology director recently explaining to me the challenges of getting discounted plans if there was a past billing issue. And so thinking that every student has access at home, there might be those students who just can't afford to have Wi-Fi or can't afford to have high-speed internet access in their house, even if, it does exist because of geography. And then the last piece, and this is really almost the trickier piece of it, is the families and the places that just might not be aware of the issue. There may be certain families that don't realize, a smartphone isn't sufficient to really complete the meaningful work that students need. There's challenges with literacy levels. The Joan Gans Cooney Center, which is the think tank for Sesame Street, did a really fascinating study looking at the digital literacy of preschool students. And one of the challenges they found was that for students who didn't have parents who were modeling how to use technology, they were coming into kindergarten and coming into preschool already behind in terms of the literacy that they would need. And the last piece, I think that's really important for all of us that are working in schools, is that teachers might not always realize that students lack equitable access at home. And it might only be 1 or 2 students in your context, but realizing that those 1 or 2 students are now potentially at a severe disadvantage. I know when I was at a small independent school, and we were moving towards using more technology, but we did have students where we realized, wow, it's only 1 or 2 students per class, but they didn't have access. And so if we didn't come up with a way to get them that access, we were going to put them at an extreme disadvantage over their classmates. And so, we were a very small population, so we were able to get everything sorted out. But it's about making teachers aware that not every student would be able to get certain things completed. I'm going to pause again. Susan, did you have anything that you'd like to add, or again, any questions?
Just one other thing I'd add is that, an important thing you were talking about, the digital literacy skills of families at home, and how kids can start school behind their peers with regard to their basic digital literacies. That can have implications on everything from standardized testing. If you want to think about how young kids are increasingly being asked to take standardized testing on computers, but if they don't have time to learn how to use a mouse or to type, or even how to use a laptop touchpad, that can have a negative impact on their scores. And then another factor I just thought I'd mention is that when it comes to the level of digital literacy of families, that also impacts their ability to stay connected with the schools in today's day and age. Because if you think about it, so many schools have online platforms that are making grades available or that are used as communication platforms for parents. And so it's really, when you talk about, people talk about like, trying to build programs that support the whole child, you really have to support the whole family, because helping parents to improve their digital literacy skills helps them support their children academically better. And we'll have to talk a little bit later in this about Beaverton School District. I really like Oregon. I really like their approach to trying to engage their Latino parent population.
Yeah. Beaverton, and also reminds me of this year's Digital Equity Award winner is Vancouver District out in Washington. And they also spent a lot of time working to make sure that they were supporting the parents and making sure that the parents felt as though that they were partners in the process. So, it's certainly an awareness issue. I'm working on a study right now with preschool students throughout the state. And one of the challenges that we've found as researchers is we designed an online survey. And even though we're trying to support families in completing that survey while we're all physically in the room together, there is still a literacy challenge, both in terms of how to navigate an online form, but also the basic, like actual reading literacy. At the summit this week, I was working with a group of librarians, and they were talking about, digital literacy and reading literacy are very closely linked. And so that's also something to keep in mind. So with all of this, it's like we started with the causes and is thinking about this idea where essentially all of these different factors are creating a problem that we need to address within our schools. And so that makes digital equity begin to be the solution. And Susan and I have talked about this a while, where had been flipping it, right? Like if digital equity is the solution, what's the problem it's trying to solve? And so really thinking about how are we helping our students have access to meaningful learning opportunities? How are we making sure that our students are able to, connect with their schools and connect with their families? How are we making sure that our families as a whole learning community, as a part of the whole learning process for our students, how are they having the access that they need so that they can really support their children? And so by considering really the ecology of the situation around a child, this is where we're really focused in on digital equity as a solution to a lot of the social challenges, that are starting to face a lot of our students today. So when thinking about digital equity, I pulled this definition from the National Digital Inclusion Association because I really liked the way that they framed it, because it was more than just this idea of, how do we make sure that everyone has equal access? And I think sometimes the conversation gets, very nuts and bolts, and we will get nuts and bolts talking about how do we make sure students have devices? How do they have bandwidth? But I liked this definition because they're saying, like, how do all individuals have the capacity for full participation in society, democracy, and economy? Because it's more than just about education. It's about that civic and cultural participation. It's about employment. It's about lifelong learning, and it's about services. And in speaking, especially with some of the rural communities, I've been learning lately about, access to banking, things that we take advantage of sometimes, access to healthcare. All of these things are becoming digital. And so without taking the digital equity into account, we're really excluding our students, not just from learning, but we're excluding our students from living. And so, this broader definition, I think, helps to really frame what the challenge is, instead of, sometimes it gets tricky because we can feel like we get bogged down and, again, the nuts and the bolts and the wires and the boxes, but then there's a lot more to it. So the way Susan and I have gone back and forth with this one. Susan first introduced me to the way she framed digital equity. She had it, I'm gonna have to shift my chair so you're not blinded by the sun going down. She had framed it as a stool, and I was having a hard time wrapping my head around it. And so thinking about digital equity almost like three interlocking puzzle pieces, because only focusing on sort of one side of it doesn't allow us to get the full picture of equity. So we will break it down and think about how we need to have all three of these components to be able to start creating this equitable environment. So we do need that access to devices. We do need that high-speed internet, but we also need to make sure that we're focused on that literacy component of, are our students, are our families, are our teachers developing the capacities that they need to take advantage of the affordances of the technology. I'm pausing again. That was a lot of information. Anyone? No? Okay, I'll keep going. So to break this down, and we're going to kind of go from like the easiest or not easiest, the most concrete to achieve to the most complex. So the first one, again, is really thinking about access to devices. And I had a very healthy debate / conversation with someone this week about, the need for a keyboard. And I was trying to argue about being self-sufficient on my tablet that doesn't have a keyboard. And I realized that was great until I had to type something really fast. And so this idea of like, how can we make sure that students have access to a full device? And I love my tablet. And at the same time, I'm like, oh, I need so much more. So how do we make sure that it's more than just a smartphone, that they do have what they need? And there's a lot of different ways that it is possible to get it. Those districts that have one-to-one programs are automatically have that first step forward, to make sure that every student has access to a device, that the school and the district is able to set up to make sure that students hopefully can take things home. Other options, there's several different districts where maybe there's a loaner device and a hotspot through the school and the library. I was talking with a district in Nebraska where, students can actually check the devices out of the cart in certain teachers' classrooms. So if they want to work on something and take it home, they can go check it out and then they bring it back the next morning. And they could do this with, just taking the device or taking a device and a hotspot. There are community organizations that do support devices. I just learned this week that there's a big push within the banking community. So if you want to go talk to your bank, they're trying to get banks to donate their devices or to donate their computers once they're ready to do a refresh of what they have, taking those computers, rebuilding them, and then being able to donate them out into, organizations and schools to support those students who don't have it. And so they're calling it the Bank Refresh, and it's under, I wrote CRA, but that's the Community Reinvestment Act, which is underneath the banking. And the last one is, there are opportunities to try, for teachers to be able to raise additional funds. I just realized I misspelled donors choose, and I will fix that. But there is, COSN worked with Donors Choose and created a toolkit. And so for district leaders, one of the things that's really nice about this is there is a way, and the toolkit will provide you more information, that you can essentially create like a district level Donors Choose, so that teachers will know what actually works in their district. I was working with a district in Massachusetts a few years ago, and they were super excited because, the PTA had done a big fundraiser and they got this cart of Chromebooks and they were all excited about it, except the PTA never found out that the school didn't have Wi-Fi. So they had all of these Chromebooks and then they couldn't use them because nobody had actually asked. So eventually they did get Wi-Fi put in the building. And so it was, a cart and a horse, and they got what they wanted in the end, which is fantastic. But, from a district's perspective, you can make it a little bit easier for your teachers to be able to then go out and try and get that funding to get devices through setting up a district level Donors Choose. And then you'll know what does actually work within your district. Because sometimes our best intentions can have some technical snafus. So, again, devices in a lot of ways is the easiest piece, of the puzzle in terms of thinking about how are we going to go about this. And I don't have it on this slide, but I think a lot of the big technology companies have done a really nice job of doing things like, 0% financing leases on being able to get devices. I know our school always leased devices because we didn't have to have that capital money to be able to get it, and then could roll things over and keep things up to date a little bit more. So, I think there's a lot of creative funding that can start to look at ways to get devices. The next challenge, which is a little bit more challenging, especially because of geography, is this idea of high-speed internet. So how are we going to make sure that all of our students, once they have their devices, are actually connected once they leave school? And so there's a couple of different strategies for thinking about home internet access. And we'll go through all 5 of these in terms of ways to think about how to get your students connected at home. So the first one really is this idea of how to create community organizations and creating like homework hotspots. And so, Susan mentioned Beaverton. This is an example from their district. They worked within their community. The district talked to a number of different businesses and organizations in the community and said, if our students need Wi-Fi access to be able to go and get their homework done, can they come into your business? And so, anybody that said, sure, we'd be happy to have students come in, they got added onto the map. They put like Wi-Fi signs outside their building so the students knew that they could go in and they could get free Wi-Fi. And essentially they created like homework hotspots. And this way everybody knew what was going on. They knew where they could go, and it created a great opportunity as well for the students to be able to get to know more people in the community, and the community to really feel more a part of the students and the students' learning. So, it can be, assuming again, geography, there is an opportunity to create these homework hotspots. Another one is to partner with local libraries and to think about building learning communities. And I just spent the first part of this week talking with a number of librarians, and they were so excited. And there's a lot of work, I think, within the public libraries that maybe we don't know about in K-12, where there's great opportunities to not only be able to get access and potentially check out devices, but to gain the expertise of a librarian and to know that the librarians are there to help with a lot of that digital literacy, the digital literacy skills and aspects. So, you know, the One Access program is in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and North Carolina. Right in Pennsylvania, Google and the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh have now partnered together. And so you can check out Chromebooks and Wi-Fi hotspots from the Carnegie Library with your library card. You know, they've got printing options. They've got people there who can help. There's a similar program in New York with the New York Public Library. And so really, I think local libraries often don't get considered as much, but they've got amazing resources, and librarians are always, you know, amazing to go work with, especially from that literacy perspective, to be able to start to create these different opportunities. So then, you know, beyond that is the ability to start thinking about low-cost broadband opportunities. And I'm actually going to turn this back over to Susan and let her get into some of these fun technical components, because she knows more about it than I do.
Sure, thanks, Beth. Well, for instance, everyoneon.org is an organization that you should know about in a website. So basically, everyoneon.org does a lot of things, but one of the great things about their website is that they serve as a clearinghouse for low-cost internet plans and programs that offer devices. So for instance, you can go to their website and you can enter your zip code, and you can enter if you are eligible for certain government social programs like Medicaid or free and reduced lunch or WIC or any of those, you know, a variety of different government programs. And it will tell you based on your zip code and the programs that you entered, or even if you didn't check any of the boxes for particular programs and just entered your zip code, it'll tell you what low-cost internet programs, internet access programs are available in your area. Plus, if there are any organizations that provide low-cost devices. So, for instance, there's one organization called PCs for People that operates in a couple of different cities, where they work with companies to refurbish computers, and then they provide refurbished computers and digital literacy education for families in need. Or it might let you know about what are the low-cost internet plans offered by the service providers. For instance, Internet Essentials is the one offered by Comcast. Most of the major service providers will offer low-cost programs for like $9.95 a month. Again, those aren't a silver bullet, as Beth mentioned earlier. They can be challenging. Sometimes families, they may not be aware of the program, or they may have past billing histories with providers that may prevent them from being eligible. And also, it may not work for low-income families that move frequently. That's often a challenge for low-income families, in which case wired internet programs aren't necessarily going to be the best solution. But again, there is no silver bullet for providing, addressing the digital divide. It's what are our existing solutions that we can cobble together. And they may be Band-Aids, but hopefully by applying enough Band-Aids, we may be able to provide some sort of coverage in the interim until such time as high-speed broadband is truly ubiquitous and affordable. As I like to say, as the way electricity is. Back in the 1930s, the federal government put forth a program called the Rural Electrification Program, and that's the reason that we have electricity in a lot of rural areas. It's because it was kickstarted by the federal government. So that hasn't happened at that scale yet in terms of broadband by the federal government. There have been a history of federal grants to help bring broadband to rural areas, but that's my dream, is that someday there is a broadband electrification program for rural areas that puts the infrastructure in place in those areas in particular where high-speed broadband is just too expensive to physically install, like fiber in areas that have, mountains or valleys or peaks or
Northern Alaska.
Or swamps, or name your tundra, or name your geographical challenge. There's several. So I would encourage you all to look at everyone.org. They have a lot of really interesting programs, and check out your local ISPs, see if they do offer a low-cost internet plan.
I'll move you to the next one.
Okay, another option. We can say something in the chat.
Yeah.
Also visited our school district on his journey to push for more internet access in rural areas. Yes. Lots of great conversations took place. We are getting there slowly, surely. Absolutely. And I think that a lot of areas where they are succeeding in putting broadband in rural areas, there is investment being made at the state level. I know that's something that Education Superhighway has been doing a lot of work with state level governments as opposed to working at the federal level. Another option to address the digital divide is to deploy mobile hotspot programs. These are just a couple of examples. Kajit is a company that provides filtered wireless hotspots for schools and districts. It's specifically geared towards educational use. And they also provide filtered Wi-Fi for school buses, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation. There's another program you may not be aware of called the 1 Million Project. So if you are at a Title I high school, you should check out their website. They provide devices with built-in wireless connectivity in Title I high schools. And there are several, it's a grant and you can apply to participate in the program. And I've known several districts that have participated. There used to be an offshoot of Sprint. Now they're just called the 1millionprogram.org. And Mobile Beacon is also a nonprofit that offers Wi-Fi hotspots, and they are not, I don't believe they are filtered out of the box, but they provide unlimited broadband access for like $10 a month, which is highly unusual. So that may also be a potential solution, even if, and it actually may be a solution for teachers as well. They're another organization that you may find helpful.
And Susan, I actually forgot one that we should add in, but Verizon has their Innovative Learning Schools program, and it's another, it would be a situation where the entire school applies into the program, and then Verizon provides, I think it's 4G enabled devices, either iPads or Windows tablets, and they also provide professional development to address that digital literacy component for the teachers who are taking part in the program. And so I think they're still accepting applications.
Excellent. So we'll have to add that to the next slide.
We'll add that to the next slide. All right. So here's your favorite, Susan.
Okay, so the reason she said this is my favorite is because I am actually working with Google. They have a philanthropic effort that's a pilot program where they are installing Wi-Fi on school buses and also providing funds for districts to hire an onboard educator to provide homework assistance for students while they are riding the bus. And the program is targeted towards districts in very rural areas who have long bus commutes, usually 45 minutes or longer. And there are 15 districts in 12 states that are participating in this initial pilot. We're still waiting to hear if the program might get funding to be expanded or not. So we don't know yet if that's going to happen. But that's been another option for some districts, is to install Wi-Fi on school buses. Because especially for those kids in rural areas that have really long commutes, that can be time that they can, if they can get their homework done while they're riding the bus, then that gives them more time when they're at home because they already have such long commutes. Some of these kids in the program, some of them have 45-minute commutes, some of them have an hour, hour and a half, even 2-hour commutes. And that's not even mentioning if kids also participate in activities. So that's another potential area is if your district has activities buses where you have kids who are traveling for 3-4 hours to get to sporting events or another activity. If there's Wi-Fi on those buses, that can provide students with the opportunity to get their homework done. There's different ways that you can get Wi-Fi on school buses. We have worked with Kajit just because they're the provider for Rolling Study Halls. So this is not a commercial in any way for Kajit, although I have to say, as a former IT director, I've been very impressed in working with them and how they've helped us implement the program. But that is another potential option if you are, again, trying to find solutions that might work in your particular district. And what we have found is that the routers that they have on these buses do have more powerful antennas than your cell phone. So there will still be cases where there may be dead spots, depending on the provider or the area, but that a lot of these bus Wi-Fi equipment, they can work with multiple providers. And because they have antennas, they have a much stronger antenna than what you have on your cell phone. So where you might have 1 bar on your cell phone, you might have 4 bars on the wireless router. So that's another potential option.
And another, positive on this coming out of Washington is there is a bipartisan bill right now that's being pushed through at the Senate level to allow E-rate funding to be used to pay for Wi-Fi on buses. And so that would be something to keep an eye on, because that has been, I don't know where it stands right now, but at least, it's another attempt at trying to make this happen.
Yeah, I think it's in committee right now, but we're keeping an eye on it and to see what happens.
So when you get really fancy.
Okay, well, this is a pretty geeky option. There are some districts who are building private LTE networks to address the homework gap. And there is a story, there's a link here at the bottom of this slide where you can learn about some of the schools who are creating these private LTE networks. There's one of the challenges with this is that there are policies in Washington at the FCC that are potentially up for change that may impact schools' ability to build these private LTE networks. One of the most common spectrum bands that is used to build these private LTE networks is something called the Educational Broadband Service, or EBS, which is wireless spectrum that can be used by educational institutions to build private LTE networks. And so originally what happened was, this was back several decades ago, this was spectrum that was originally supposed to be used for educational television. And then it was recast as being allowed for districts to use it for educational broadband service. And I believe this was back in the 90s. And districts at that time didn't understand the need or didn't have the technical expertise to build their own private LTE networks. So they leased their spectrum to telecommunications companies, mainly Sprint, and Sprint, and locked them into long-term leases where, for instance, Sprint uses that spectrum for providing just commercial cellular service. And so there are some districts, however, who do have their EBS licenses, or who were able to get them back out of the leases, or who never leased them, who are able to build their own private networks using educational broadband spectrum. Now, the challenge is that new licenses are not currently being granted and haven't been granted for a while. And the FCC may be lifting the restrictions on reserving that particular band, the 2.5 gigahertz band, for educational use. So this is kind of a hot topic for telecom policy wonks in Washington right now. It's something that COSN recently signed a joint statement along with Shelby and some other organizations asking the FCC to allow school districts to acquire EBS licenses and not to remove the educational use requirement for this spectrum, because otherwise, if the spectrum is auctioned off to private companies, then it's gone forever and can't ever be used by districts to resolve to help address the digital divide. So we are keeping an eye on this issue in Washington. In fact, there was just a letter that was just released by Shelby, I believe a couple days ago, asking the FCC to delay the proceedings until they could get more information. So COSN is definitely keeping an eye on this issue with EBS, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that we can keep the spectrum reserved for educational use.
And one of the pieces on this that they were just talking about this week is they did have a really well-known economist who did a study on what would be the cost-benefit analysis of making this internet available for schools versus auctioning it off for the private sector. And he has a very compelling case that it would actually be of greater benefit, not only for reducing the digital divide, but also just in terms of the national economy if they kept it for education. And so hopefully someone will listen on that point, because it has great potential, particularly for rural areas, to be able to address the homework gap and to address the digital divide. So I'm going to pause there again and see if does anyone have questions?
We provide an E-rate. Okay, I will find a link to the E-rate funding bill and post it in the chat. And Shelby, thank you for asking what Shelby means. It is, I'll type it in the message. It's SHLB. It's the Schools Health, HEAL, and Libraries Broadband Coalition.
And
great organization, doing amazing work with a staff of 3 in Washington.
Oh, so I met all 3 of them then.
Yeah.
I didn't realize there was a staff of 3.
they're really focused on helping community anchor institutions and sort of getting broadband to and through community anchor institutions as a way to bring connectivity into underserved areas. And Beth, if you want to continue, I'll go ahead and see if I can find to that E-rate bill.
Yes, and I mean, this doesn't help us today, but I do have an article on Getting Smart that is scheduled to come out on the 20th that talks both about the E-rate bill and also Senator Murray's Digital Equity Act. So we can definitely get, I can't seem to talk and find links at the same time, but I can also fill in what Susan doesn't find. So to come into sort of our third puzzle piece, which I think in a lot of ways is really the more complex puzzle piece, but is really ways to start tackling the digital literacy component. And so there's a lot of ways that we can start to get creative and thinking about how do we help not only address, thinking about it in conjunction with addressing the access and the internet components. And there's a few great examples that we can share with you. And I would encourage, there's a quote from Michael Fullan, who some of you may have read some of his books. I think he's written like 50 of them. He's a professor in Canada, and he talks about how great systems never try to imitate. Instead, they learn and adapt from others. And so when I think about a lot of these solutions, I always try and keep in mind, like if I was a system, how can I learn and adapt where I may not be able to completely replicate? And I think especially with digital literacy, I would say there's probably a lot of nuggets in here that might apply to a range of different contexts. Again, beyond thinking about the traditional, like what are we doing in our classrooms and in our schools, one of the first examples is in Omaha, Nebraska. They created the Mobile Learning Unit. And, I think Susan and I have found a number of different examples of something similar to this, where essentially, they've combined like this idea of having, a mobile community hotspot on a bus. But inside the bus is they've really set it up like a rolling study hall or a rolling computer lab. Susan and I met a woman from a district in Alabama where they had a rolling computer lab, or they called it the rolling computer lab, and they parked it in a different neighborhood every day of the week. And the students knew that for like 3 hours, the bus was going to be parked in their neighborhood, and they could come on board, they could get homework done. And in addition to having teachers on board who could help, they even had teachers staying back at school so they could have like virtual tutors back and forth to really support the students. And so it's amazing, thinking about how can we reimagine, the idea of a bus. And this would be one example where we can provide, again, not only access, but also, that literacy support. One that I really like is what's happening in Chicago Public Library, where they talk about having a community learning circle. And so this is really more for adult learners, but I think a similar model could probably be, adaptive for students, whether it was in a school library or in a public library. But the learners meet in a public space, and then they complete online coursework together. And in this particular example, P2PU has free online courses for people. And so, learners would meet at the Chicago Public Library, and there would be a librarian who would help them in person, and they would have, face-to-face discussions, and they would really benefit, as a group from the social learning that we know is so valuable for students, and also get the support to complete an online course that would give people the confidence to maybe take another course and to continue to learn. And so again, thinking how can we adapt this in a K-12 context? Maybe it's, homework learning circles that could happen in a school library after hours or in the public library. Or I met some folks this week where they're, thinking about community colleges. Can students partner with the librarians in community colleges and get some benefit from there? The historically HBCU, so the historically Black college and universities, and there were a number of professors there who said, we want to be part of the solution. We see equity as really important, and so we want to be part of this conversation. And so thinking about how can we start to bridge the physical and the digital, both for access, but also, again, for that literacy component. And then, I think all of this really comes down to, what Susan gets the credit for this. She's developed this digital equity toolkit, which really, here's the link to where it is on our COSN website. It's got case studies and examples and lots of different ideas that, again, you can think about how can I address this three three-component issue of access, internet, and literacy. And it's something that, you know, I've now inherited and I'm working on. So hopefully we'll have an update of this we will have an update for this for 2020. If I say it enough times, I know it will happen. And I think, you know, what we really advocate for after this is how can you now take all of this information, which really is in parts and pieces, and start to think through this idea of like, how could I build out a digital equity plan? Because, you know, it's one thing to have these different ideas. And I think it's very easy to get focused on, oh, we'll just get the devices, or, oh, we're going to deal with the internet. And when it's not holistic, it can get difficult. So we've, you know, really thinking about it as a 4-step plan or a 4-step process to be building this plan. And the first one is to think about the team. You know, who needs to be on your team, and who's going to be your champion, and how many voices are you going to have? And with that, I've learned a few lessons just listening to district leaders lately. You know, one of them with who's on your team, I spoke with Pam Moran and Ira Sokol, who were in Albemarle, Virginia. And when they talk about how a decision was made, they can put a student name on it. And they say, well, we made this decision because of this student. And so their idea of making sure that you have all of your voices, I mean, they had the student voices involved to figure out like, how are we really going to meet the needs of all of our students? And then this idea of, you know, are we focused on equity or equality? And Phil Heinz, who's the CTO in Gurnee, Illinois, I thought explained it really eloquently when I was talking to him, where he said, you know, when I looked at what we could do, you know, I could get everybody equal access. And he was saying he could get, you know, laptop carts in the school, and it would be about 3 to 1, and they would all have equal access. And everyone was saying, we need laptops. He said, but the problem is that didn't create equitable access, because not all of our students had laptops at home. So instead they shifted around and they went with iPads, which were a less expensive device. But he said, well, now I can focus on equity, because I can make sure that every student has a device and can have internet access and can have the tools that they need. And so, you know, really thinking about this idea of equity, meeting all of our students' needs versus trying to hit that equality of like, well, here's what we can pay and we can get equal access, which may not be equitable access depending on your student population. And then, you know, the second step is to think about, you know, what are your community's needs? You know, we've given you a lot of potential solutions, and they may or may not apply to your community and culture and context. I was driving through southern Utah a couple months ago, and it's, you know, 10 miles between buildings, and a community Wi-Fi map would have been useless because it's 10 miles to get from one building to the next. Whereas a community Wi-Fi map, like where I live in a nice small town, would be great because you can walk all the way from one end of town to the next. You know, but thinking again about, you know, what are your structures? What are your systems? Who are your people? Who do you need to administer things? Again, thinking about Phil, he made sure that he had people who could explain. He has a high Spanish-speaking population. So on his technology team, he had to make sure that they could communicate in Spanish. You know, how do they make sure that they could meet the needs of the community and in terms of being able to share this information? You know, and then again, you know, who are going to be your champions, and having community buy-in. Every district that I've spoken to has talked about the real importance of making sure the entire community understands, you know, the purpose of these efforts. You know, how does it benefit the broader community when our students have the most meaningful learning opportunity that they can possibly get? You know, are you inviting the community, you know, the business community, the parents? You know, it's broader than just the students, so that they become stakeholders and can support these programs both, you know, financially and with resources and infrastructure, you know, expertise. So, you know, really thinking through that idea of stakeholders and partners. And then the last part would be to think about designing and executing a plan. And, you know, one of the things with a plan is it can seem incredibly daunting, you know, like, how am I going to tackle this big, huge thing? And so, you know, one piece I would encourage you to think about is how do you do, you know, smaller cycles and pilots. The group I was working with this week, we started talking about the 3 Ps of pilot, prototype. Oh gosh, and I forgot our third P. We were piloting, prototyping, and something else that had a P in it. But basically this idea of, how are we doing things that are a little bit smaller so we can figure out what works in our context? Wi-Fi on buses could be phenomenal, or maybe it doesn't work. So instead of taking, a fleet of 50 buses, maybe you start with 1 or 2, see what really starts to work. Because ultimately, I think, excuse me, what's important is to think about how are we making these cycles of improvement. Just because we start to execute one plan, we might need to adapt, and time's going to change and infrastructure is going to change. And so how are we constantly thinking about ways to make improvements to our students' learning? I'm so sorry, excuse me. So we're really at a point now where, we've got some other resources for you beyond what we have at CoSN. There's some great partners and coalitions who are looking at all this challenge of digital equity. And excuse me, I think, one of the big takeaways is realizing that it's not just about what schools are doing on their own, but how are schools really partnering with the community to really tackle this issue, because it's massive and it's not necessarily something that, just one school or just one organization can potentially do. So, there's a lot of different groups that are taking this on, and I think there's some really great resources to look at moving forward. Phew, I'm going to pause, stop, and see if we have any other thoughts or questions. Or Susan, did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I'd love to know if there are any questions, though.
Yeah.
And if you have questions that come up after the webinar, please feel free to email us, because we love talking about this stuff.
Yeah. So here's our contact information again. And, we are both more than happy to help, and we're both very responsive people. So you should hear from us pretty quickly if anything comes up.
Awesome. Great information on a issue facing our students across the Pennsylvania on a daily basis. So I want to thank everyone for logging on tonight. If there's no other questions. Okay, well, thank you again, Ms. Baird and Dr. Holland, for logging on with us. Those of you, the webinar will be posted here in the coming days on our website if you'd like to log back on and get some additional information. So if there's no other questions, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and wish you have the best rest of the week.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
thanks everyone.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.